like to call the meeting of May 19th, 2009 of the City Council Ordinance Committee to order. Item for consideration today is proposed amendments to the purchasing code. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Bob Samario. I'm the Assistant Finance Director, and I'm joined today by Bill Hornung. He's our General Services Manager. Obviously had a big part in putting this together. And I just also wanted to mention that Scott Vincent is, of course, here as the city attorney. He played a big part in developing the language that's here for your consideration, both in terms of just reorganization of it and the making it more readable. So we'll get into that in more detail, but I really wanted to thank and acknowledge his effort on this. So we're here for two reasons. The first is to discuss with you the proposed amendments to the purchasing code. And the purchasing code is what we kind of refer to as informally, but it is actually part of the municipal code, section 4.52. And it governs all purchases of ordinary goods and services. So everything we buy in the city is governed by that code, 4.52. What's not included within that section is what we refer to or call public works contracts. Those are actually covered by the charter, section 519 of the city charter, so they're not part of the municipal code. So that's not included in this discussion. It's everything but public works contracts. And you may recall that on February 3rd of this current calendar year, we were here to go over our proposed amendments to the purchasing code. We presented to them really at a conceptual level, and we are here today then to go over those in more detail and actually show you the specific language that we are proposing to implement those changes. And kind of as I alluded to at the beginning, to a large degree, the changes you're going to be seeing are just to make the purchasing code more readable, better organized. There was a lot of confusion and ambiguity. Things were sort of spread out in different places. So we wanted to make it more readable, and that was where Scott Vincent came in and he helped us with that. There are some substantive changes, things that we've been doing really in practice for many years that we wanted to incorporate and codify into the purchasing code. So the second part of the presentation today is going to be covering debarment procedures. We are proposing a resolution to establish procedures for the debarment of contractors. When we talked about this back on February 3rd, we had intended to make it part of the code in these changes that we'll be discussing, but we decided really on the advice of the attorney's office that maybe it would be too burdensome to bog down the code with all this detail, and we opted for a resolution that goes into the details of the procedures. So we'll go cover that after we're done with the proposed changes to the code. And so with that, unless there are any questions about just sort of what we're talking about, I'll turn it over to Bill Hornung, and he'll go over and remind you of what we talked about at a conceptual level, and then show you actually the detailed language.
Bill?
Bob's going to help me with some of the presentations, so anybody viewing this will be able to see what we're talking about. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go word by word. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any time, and I'll address them as they come up. What I'd like to do is discuss the sections that apply to the 10 items in the agenda report where there were significant changes. You'll see some items in the agenda report may be reflected in various sections within the municipal code overhaul. The first thing we did, which is agenda item number 1, the environmentally preferred purchasing. As you may recall, back in December, we brought a policy to council, which was adopted. And at that time, we said we'd kind of incorporate that concept into the municipal code update. And the way we've done that is to update the language in the purpose statement. And we added the last paragraph, which kind of encapsulates the concept of environmentally preferred purchasing. In addition, there could be different meanings to environmentally preferred purchasing. We incorporated a definition as well, which is on page 2 of the revised code. If there's not any questions, I'm going to go on to the agenda item number 2 in the report.
Bill, I think page 2, where not only an agenda item, is the items that are listed that we're going to be discussing 1 through 10 start on page 2 of the agenda report.
It's on the attachment. Page 2 is the definitions. We added that for a couple different reasons. Part of it's a best practice and also to improve communication so that we all have a common understanding of what a term means, such as environmentally preferred purchasing. That's defined in here. The city had a past practice for emergency purchases, but there wasn't really a definition, so we added the definition. I'm not going to go through each term we define, but the significant ones, in addition to the ones that I've mentioned, is maintenance and repair. Because sometimes a maintenance and repair of a building might look like a public works, and we'll talk about this in more detail later on, but we came up with a definition of what constitutes a maintenance repair activity. And the same thing with a professional service, because professional services was just a gap in the code. It wasn't addressed, and processes developed just by the absence of any direction in the code or the charter. Are there any questions on any of the definitions?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have one, if I may.
Committee Member House.
On page 3 on reverse auction, where it talks about the city announcing a need for equipment, supply, services on the internet, and then it says, or in some other manner, and suppliers bid against one another in real time. And this is, I think, for the city attorney. I can imagine in today's environment that the internet is just a normal part of business, and that's probably adequate. But does the city have to notice that kind of an opportunity in other ways besides on the internet, or could we actually do that on the internet the way it seems to indicate here, and just have that be the noticing for that, or does it have to be posted elsewhere or sent out in hard copy, or have we now entered the new age where we can do it all on the internet without all the rest?
Mr. Chair, the way that the reverse auction definition is written is to anticipate both the use of the internet as not only a noticing media, but also as the actual location of the auction.
Okay.
The phrase "or some other manner" is to anticipate the idea of actually conducting a reverse auction in a physical presence. That so it could be done at a site within the city if it was noticed that way. The noticing requirements would be still specified based on the dollar amount, whether it's within the formal procedures or the informal procedures. That would dictate the noticing requirements for the particular purchase. Whether a purchase on a reverse auction would fall within informal or formal, I would expect, since we don't really know the price until the end of the auction,
right,
it would be based on an estimate of the anticipated value of the purchase.
Okay, I understand. So it's based on the value, the kind of noticing that would be required, and what you're identifying here in the definitions is a venue where this kind of activity could take place, the internet. Okay, thanks.
If I may add on, the notice requirements would be the same as if we're going to do a traditional purchase. Just the method of how we're doing a purchase would differ. And as you recall, at one point we were looking at replacing the financial management system. Some of the packages we look at now, part of their purchasing module, have like a reverse auction feature. So this puts a definition to that if we decide to go down that path. The third item on the agenda report is contracting authority, and it's on page 5 of the municipal code attachment. The reason we added this section is it's not really it's a new section, but not really new, in that the authority was kind of shotgun through the code. In some areas it wasn't addressed, so you had to go back to the charter. So what we do is kind of consolidate all the authority in one section and make it easier to determine who can do what. So for my purposes, I think it's kind of a clarity, readability issue. If you're looking at the handout, I'm going to skip the next one, which is 4.52030. There are just some minor edits to that. There's no substance changes.
So, Bill, just so that I know the code really well, this is the contracting authority for supplies and services, but not for capital projects.
Correct. Again, as Bob kind of did the introductory statements, we're talking about general services, supplies, and equipment.
Just for clarification, I just asked the question for clarification.
Really, the next paragraph that comes up relates to item number 4, which is bidding and award procedures. It's on page 6. The title is 4.52060, which is contracts up to $25,000. Again, this is sort of a readability clarification issue. Some of the concepts in here were separate sections in the code, and we kind of put them all under this one heading so that if you're in a department and you have a requisition that's under $25,000, you can go here and it talks about what's required. You need a requisition. If it's a sole source, what needs to be done. The encumbrance used to be a separate section. It talks about you can't spend money if you haven't budgeted for it. So it's all captured on this under this one heading. And then we did the same thing on for the formal contracting procedures, which is 4.52070. Part of that is for clarification, and we did add a couple new concepts in there just to improve the efficiency. The things that are new in here is the rejection of bids. Prior, if we went out for bid and it's something I had authority to award because it was budgeted, we advertised and went through the prescribed process. If everything was over budget and we wanted to reject it, we had to go to council, and that's kind of inefficient. So this grants me the authority to reject all bids, and then we could re-advertise for whatever we need to do. And that was mainly done out of, for efficiency purposes. The other concept in here that's new is when no bids are received. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen on occasions. It allows the purchasing agent, after we advertise and do all the prescribed procedures, if we don't receive any bids, we can go to what we call an informal process and call up dealerships or distributors and get quotes for the item without re-advertising. Again, part of that's an efficiency measure because we have a minimum of 10 working days to advertise. So, and typically we allow more time to respond because there is a correlation between how long you give people to respond and the number of bids you receive and the quality of the bids. So when we've had instances where we had to go out and re-advertise like 2 or 3 times, and you have a department that needs something. Now, instead of taking weeks, you're talking months. And those are really the only new concepts that were added under that section. The next item is agenda item number 5 in the agenda report, which covers emergency purchases. We have an emergency in the charter. As you may recall, that deals more with like a natural disaster where there's a citywide declared emergency. What this section does, it codifies our existing practice. If the waste treatment plant has a pump that's broken and it's going to back up and flood sewage in the street, we don't have the luxury of going through our normal competitive process. We need to deal with that. And this just codifies our current practice. What it does, allows the department head to declare an emergency. They're authorized to expend whatever's necessary to deal with the immediate emergency. And then if it's over $25,000, they'll come back to council and say, here's the emergency, here's why it was emergency, and here's what we spent to address it. I think Grant was going to ask a question.
Do you have a question, Mr. House?
I just didn't hit my button right. Yes, there have been occasions since I've been on council where we will be asked to authorize something after the fact, and the usual explanation has been because it was an emergency. And I'm gathering that this is now documenting the procedure that we were going through during that emergency, and so in the future it has a foundation.
Correct.
Okay.
You've probably seen some of those, like with the water treatment, where they needed because of the fires, they had to procure things to treat the water.
It really, I mean, I remember them. One of the things it requires is that the department head or the city administrator declare the need to make the emergency purchase in writing. Mm-hmm. And now it seems like sometimes in those emergencies it'd be easy to forget to do that because things are really going real quick. Have you figured out procedures that will follow the adoption of this to assist them in a situation like that?
We have procedures in place, and they can do that afterwards. We'll set up an email.
Where they're
But,
writing up
currently,
the-
our procedures, we have a separate log and sequence of purchase order numbers.
Okay.
So when we look at something, we know that's not an ordinary purchase order. And we don't question the emergency. If they go, we need a pump's broken, it's emergency, we have to repair it, we'll issue the number to them, and then it'll kind of follow this procedure after the fact to explain why it was an emergency and why we had to circumvent our normal
Like a
processes.
report. It's almost like turning in a report, but it then is associated with an emergency purchase order.
Correct.
Okay, it's very clear. Thanks.
The next couple sections in the report are just cosmetic changes. The next change of substance is on page 15. It relates to agenda report item number 6, maintenance and repair services. One thing I want to note, we're going to change the heading of it. Right now it reads maintenance agreements. We're going to change that to read maintenance and repair services. We reused the heading of our previous code, but that code dealt only with like maintenance of office equipment. And we expanded this to include all maintenance and repair services. And the reason this is important is that maintenance and repair has a different process. When council passed resolution 97052, what that did is it raised the thresholds under maintenance agreements. So unless it's over $75,000, we don't need to do the formal advertised process. We can do an informal process. So this paragraph kind of encompasses all maintenance and repairs. And the reason we didn't put a specific limit in here of $75,000 for the formal process was to preserve council's flexibility through adopting a new resolution that can change those limits. What it does do is it incorporates sections 4.52, 060, which we'd follow that informal process. Although the limits are higher, that's what we'd follow. And when it's over $75,000 and we need to do a formal process, we go back to section 4.52, 070. So we'd use the process, just the dollar thresholds would be different. And as you may recall, I mentioned earlier, we came up with a definition, and we put a definition of maintenance and repair so that hopefully that everybody have a common understanding. I guess the other little nuance for maintenance repair that we talked about at the last meeting, the reason we wanted to have a common definition, sometimes if you're putting a roof, you're re-roofing a building, is that a maintenance and repair? Is that a public works? See, with public works, it's not part of this process, and it has lower thresholds. They go through a formal process at $25,000, and they bring it back to council to award the contract. Whereas a maintenance repair, it doesn't come back to council. So we wanted to make sure we establish what the definition, so everybody knows what it looks like, and then what the process is.
Mr. House. For clarification, and so in your example, a replacement of a roof, which is on a regular, over some schedule, unless there was a storm that damaged it or something, but even still, that would be maintenance or repair based on this definition, as I just read it in here. But the replacement of the facility would be a capital item, and it wouldn't be considered maintenance and repair.
Correct.
Okay.
It'd go back if they're going to change this the purpose of this room and remodel it. It's not going to be a council room. You wouldn't call that a maintenance and repair because now you're not maintaining it, you're not repairing it, you're remodeling the room to change the intended use. And that's why we wanted to have a definition, because sometimes you kind of get in these gray areas.
You know, I do have a question about that, and it might be a question for you, Bill, or Mr. Samario, because a couple of years back we started looking at every time there was a roof replacement, just assessing whether solar would be appropriate for it. It was something that was discussed from council. I'm not sure if it was ever created in a formal policy. But I guess we always figured, well, we'd be able to handle those on a case-by-case basis because they come to us. And I suppose that would happen still when it involves a expenditure of RDA funds, but it doesn't always. And so I wonder, how are we going to make sure that we continue to, as a city, analyze each time a roof replacement comes by, whether it be appropriate for solar or for a power purchase agreement for solar or other things.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I think that's really a question for Jim Dewey. He's the building superintendent or manager. I'm not sure what their process is for evaluating both the schedule for replacing roofs and when they consider solar projects. So I'm not really sure I can answer that question. That's going to be on the scope of it.
Then before this comes to council, I'd just love to have Mr. Dewey sort of comment on how this would affect that flow of work.
In the context that it's considered a maintenance repair or a capital project, or?
Yes, because if it was a capital project, it always would be coming to us, so therefore we could make sure that it was being analyzed. This takes a little bit more faith on our part. And it obviously seems to be more efficient, but I would want to just hear that we now have a system in place where we are looking at each one of these when a repair job comes through.
Right.
I can partially answer that question.
Okay. All right.
From a process point of view, we'd rely, as Bob said, I'd rely on the end user, whether that's Jim Dewey or another department, because purchasing doesn't write specifications. But once we receive the rec, if they're adding solar, that's an improvement. It's not a maintenance and repair. So from my interpretation, I know Scott, hopefully Scott has the same interpretation. I'd treat that as a public works project.
Yeah.
Here's where I'm coming from on this, is because we generally when we're obtaining solar, we're doing that without our own capital costs, because we're generally doing them through power purchasing agreements. But it extends the life of the equipment, in this case the roof. But when say a small department that doesn't normally deal with things like this has a roof replacement, it seems like a kind of hassle if they would have to go through the process of looking at whether it would be an appropriate place for solar. So I could see where there would be a tendency to not look at that, even though it is the policy of this council to look at it in every case. And so if we don't see it and the council level, because it's maintenance and repair, I could see how it could unfold in a way where we're not putting as much solar as we should be.
Mr. Chair, if I could, just a couple of comments. First, any roof repair or replacement is going to be handled through the building maintenance division. An individual department won't be sort of responsible for their own roof repair and say, well, I don't want to worry about solar projects or solar panels. It'll all be coordinated through Jim Dewey and his staff.
Okay.
But you're right in that a repair of a roof or replacement of a roof is considered a maintenance project and therefore would not come to council unless we were to bypass normal bidding procedures. But if we follow normal bidding procedures, you would not see that. And your point is that you want to make sure that anytime we are embarking on such a project, that we are bringing that to council so they can consider the merits of whether we should be putting in solar panels or not, because the current process doesn't provide for that. So, and I think we can communicate that to Jim Dewey, and we can talk about it more to make sure that he is aware that anytime he is considering such a project, that solar panels are considered as part of that, and they're brought to council.
Right, and I'm sure you'll have a satisfactory answer. I just want to ask the question to make sure that our process is equipped for it.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Vincent.
Just one more point of clarification regarding the definition of maintenance and repair, because that definition has two parts to it. First is it provides a working definition of maintenance and repair as the routine, recurring, or usual work for the restoration or preservation of the condition of an existing facility. There's the definition. Now, your example has raised one of the gray areas that we're trying to deal with. And in order to deal with the multiplicity of ways maintenance and repair comes up, and the fact that in some cases there will be improvements associated with the maintenance and repair, we have a second part of it that basically in those gray areas, or if a question arises regarding the proper characterization, the definition now assigns the purchasing agent as the authority to determine the ultimate designation. Is it a public work when we have a new facility, or is it basically comes down to the primary purpose of the project. Is the project to have a new facility, or is it to extend the life of an existing facility? And the purchasing agent would be the employee to make that final determination.
Mr. House.
Well, and I think this just brings up an opportunity, and I think Mr. Samario got it, and that is that in this particular case, and this is just maybe one of many examples, but this exact example, you've got the repair of the roof, which is under maintenance and repair. That's not before council, but some kind of internal trigger that would indicate a review of whether that isn't the appropriate moment to bring a capital improvement forward. And I think that's what we really want to see happen. When you fix a hole in the roof, that's a little different. You're replacing a roof. Let's take a look. And they may be two separate projects, but if we can get that to be triggered somehow and have some assurance that that would happen, that would be helpful.
Right. Of course, the reason why we tried to look at it at that time is it's the cheapest time to look at solar is when there's a roof replacement. Okay, so on to...
I'll take the action to get together, Jim, and...
Great. Thank you, Bill.
Because we might need to just update whatever the current practice is, because the way we're handling maintenance and repair hasn't changed, but now we're codifying it and putting it into the code so I can see what their internal process is.
Right.
The seventh item on the agenda report is surplus personal property. It's on page 17 of the municipal code update. We made a couple of changes to the current surplus property procedure to improve the efficiency. One of them is that if we only have a few items and they have nominal value, we have limited storage space here. So it grants the purchasing agent the authority to sell those items if they're valued under $500. So the waterfront has some buoys, and we don't want to go through the expense of advertising, have an auctioneer pick them up. And if it's just a few items, a lot of times they don't want to make the trip. So it allows us to kind of dispose of those items. The second thing, it allows us to sell items to other government agencies. So, like, I know several years ago we shut down duplicating. Under this code would allow us to do, if the county wanted a press that we no longer use, we could just sell it, give it to them, because it's still benefiting the community. But it puts a ceiling on it. So those were the two significant changes to surplus property.
If I may, I don't know if it's a necessary word here, the word personal. It's not defined. And if personal property were important as a construct, I believe it should be included in the definitions.
Okay.
And if it's not, if it's just surplus property and that's sufficient, then that would work too. So.
Yeah, the word personal in that made me read it several times to really understand it. It's kind of
But to make sure
counterintuitive of a term.
Okay.
Because personal sounds like it doesn't belong to the city.
Mr. Chair.
And so...
The distinction of personal property is converse to real property. And so that concept is movable property, property that's not affixed to the ground is personal property. Real property is terra firma. And so
Needs a definition. Then
we can add it to the definition section.
I know for lay people like us, it's kind of helpful. Thank you.
That's where sometimes you're too close to the trees.
So next time someone says that's my personal property, I'll have a real snappy Scott Vincent answer for them. All right.
We wanted to make sure
please proceed.
we knew we weren't selling real estate.
Then you get into the definition of what's real and not, Das.
Okay.
The eighth item in the agenda report is cooperative purchasing. We did a major overhaul of that section. The previous, it's on page 17 and 18 of the code update. The old code had some artificial restrictions. It only allowed us to piggyback on contracts that were let by the County of Santa Barbara or other municipal entities within the County of Santa Barbara. So if we wanted to buy the same fire truck that the City of LA has purchased and they're buying a much larger volume, we couldn't easily do that. We'd have to go back to council and get permission to use the County of LA's contract. So this is considered a best practice in purchasing, is leverage your purchasing power by being able to take advantage of cooperative agreements. And we do this occasionally. We broke it into two sections: the true cooperative purchasing agreement. An example would be with our fuel bids. We'd go out with the County of Ventura. We'd actually tell them our estimates of fuel. They'd be the lead agency. They do a bid, and then we'd point to that agreement when we issue our purchase orders. The other way, which is Part B, titled surrogate bidding, that's where we take advantage of, like the County of LA, we might tell them we need a fire engine. They went out and bought 10 of them, but we want the same thing they have. Or IT does that occasionally, where there's a cooperative called the Western States Contracting Alliance, and there's a whole smorgasbord of these cooperative purchasing. But what they require is that you have to have a certain volume, and if you have that volume, you can be a lead agency, and then they make it available to all public agencies. So if there's a lead agency, whether it's the state of California, the state of Michigan, for like Dell computers or just for computers, and it happens to be Dell, and that's what we want to buy, we could take advantage of their volume purchasing. Is there any questions on the cooperative purchasing? I think the key thing we codified in here is that we can take advantage of these agreements, but they need to go through a competitive process similar to ours. If they had a higher threshold and they just sole source something, we couldn't use that agreement if they exceeded our competitive thresholds. But as long as they went through a kind of a parallel process, then we could use the agreement.
Mr. House?
Just a practical question. I'm curious as to how it works. So there's, we would assume that that kind of an arrangement would be of benefit to a smaller jurisdiction like our own, and the buying power would benefit us. Who's responsible for ensuring that that really is so?
It's a collaboration between purchasing, kind of our commodity knowledge, and also working with the departments. Because that's sort of the discussion we'll have, and I'll actually go back and look how things are awarded.
Okay, so it's actually internal. It's a discussion between purchasing and the department head or whomever is actually in charge of purchasing at that level. Okay, thanks.
There's a lot of times the department, like at IT equipment, they might have their finger on the pulse a little closer than myself or my staff. But we can a lot of times they may not be aware of these agreements, and we can point them to agreement, and then we'll look and go, because sometimes they've gotten their own quotes for budget purposes, and we can kind of look to see if we're saving them money or not.
Yeah, I mean, and also on the other side, saving the money may not be a great thing if it weren't either current state of the art or durable or high quality or whatever the requirements, whatever the specifications are of the department, right? So it's on both sides.
Correct.
I think that was really where my concern. It goes both ways on what you're getting for your money as well.
And sometimes these larger agreements, because they're buying in volume, there can be extra value-added services that we may not get if we go out on our own that are bundled in with the purchase, whether it's telephone support or extended warranties and things of that nature.
Got it. All right. Thank you. I'm so sorry. This is, if you don't mind, it's sort of a conversation here. I just want to ask, do you keep track of, like, when you make a purchasing decision like that, do you make a note of the particular rationale or in case you need to defend that in the future for any particular reason?
Well, what I'll do if we're using, right now it's more restrictive, but we're allowed to use contracts for the state of California. I left that out of the example. That was the other permissible piggybacking. So if we're going to use a contract by the state of California, you saw right per municipal code section, XYZ, we're allowed to piggyback off state of California contracts.
I
So if
see.
an auditor grabbed that and didn't see, you didn't advertise this, how could you do this? I point to the enabling code.
But in the documentation of the actual purchase itself, would you somewhere along the way identify some of the reasons why it was of particular value to the department to go in that direction? Not to create extra paperwork, but I mean, if there are some really important value addeds there, it would seem that you'd want to somehow.
If they've gotten
Mark
quotes,
that.
we might make a note how the contract's saving us money. If they're buying like 5 computers and we're not really required and we're using this data, I'm just going to
Right.
write, maybe
Sure.
require informal competition but not advertising.
Right.
I'm just going to point to the code that allows me to do so.
Okay.
But I don't really do a price analysis, no.
Mr. Chair, if I could. Ultimately, the department knows what they want and it develops the specifications, so they wouldn't be participating in that cooperative agreement unless they met those specifications. So what they're trying to do is get the best price and the best terms based on the product, assuming that the product does meet those specifications. If it doesn't, they don't go there. But, they do all the homework to make sure, yes, these are the computers that we've been looking for with these specifications. Once they meet that basic need, then they see if it actually provides them with greater savings, better terms, and conditions, et cetera.
No, that answers my
Okay.
question too, because you're really in an organization like this, you're relying on the specifications, and then once you've met that, then you can get the value added, and you've exceeded the specifications. Okay, that helps me understand how you do
And
that.
departments are very budget conscious, so when they look at these things, they know if it's a good price or not. So we rely on that to a certain extent as well.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's go to debarment process. This is meat here, and we need some time to go through it.
Okay. So I'll assume there's no questions of professional services. It just points to the charter. What we did in the code for the sake of brevity, because we didn't want to have 20 pages of a process in the code, we wrote that it enables the city administrator to develop a debarment process. And I'll use that as a lead-in to go into the debarment process. I think Scott did a lot of the heavy lifting, but we both kind of looked at what other agencies were doing. And we tried to mirror our process of the other agencies that have been challenged. So if we ever go to court, we know our process will hold up because it's already kind of withstood those type of challenges. Instead of going through page by page, I just like to point out a couple of what I consider key items. One is the statement of purpose. The reason we develop this process is to make sure that we're doing business with responsible persons. A debarment process is also alluded to in the living wage ordinance, but we really don't have a debarment process. And because you're talking about somebody's livelihood as a businessman or woman, you need to make sure you give them due process. So we developed this procedure around to preserve their due process rights. Again, also, contractors don't like bidding against other contractors that are cutting corners and doing things that are not fair. So it also promotes fairness that when we go out for bid, that we're looking at all responsible bidders. One of the key things here is that the city administrator will appoint a hearing officer. That person's going to be an impartial person. So it's not going to be from the same department that's requesting a firm to be debarred. And that's paragraph 3 of the, unfortunately I took out my page numbers, but it's paragraph 3 entitled Debarment Hearing Officer to be appointed. Page 4, okay. And to me, the next critical item is paragraph 6. The grounds for debarment. It kind of describes some of the behaviors that could lead to debarment. If you're bid rigging, you're forging your documents, we request one type of product and you substitute an inferior product and don't tell us. Those are all the type of things that could lead to debarment.
Bill, I had a question on this because there are, in our experience in our committee and in other experiences that I've had dealing with the procurement process, that part of what prevents us from from understanding and analyzing our purchasing policies and really knowing what's going on with our purchasing policies is uncooperativeness with information, which it in itself could be innocent or in itself could be hiding of information that could lead to one of these things. And so shouldn't we have some kind of provision, where if we ask somebody who is getting a decent amount of money from the city for some basic information, and we repeatedly ask them for that basic information, shouldn't that be grounds enough to be, and that's easier to prove than any of this other stuff.
I have to look. I thought there was a provision here where it talks about not providing information.
Okay, I didn't see it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. So if you, please continue, and if you can answer that question.
Well, like on the first one, one of the things is any offense indicating a lack of business integrity or business honesty. So if we're asking for records and not providing it, you could say it falls under there.
Well, I mean,
I thought we called about that.
I don't know. It might be something that we want to look at that's more specific, because many of these things are very difficult to prove. On the other hand, if we ask a contractor for the same piece of information 3 times, that's very easy for us to prove. And I don't, for some reason or another, when we ask these folks information, they really don't always provide it to us, which makes it harder to have a transparent process. So I'm just asking you to maybe think about that. I don't necessarily. So think about that for the end of the presentation of what we might do with that.
I think your question may be partially answered later on.
Okay, great.
If you look under D5, it says the person willfully failed to cooperate in the investigation or hearing of a proposed debarment. So if you're asking for information, except I think you're taking a different angle. You want to debar them because they're not providing it.
Right, because the even to get to the point where we're initiating a debarment requires us to do research, and if everybody just doesn't cooperate with the research of the city, then we'll never debar anyone, because we'll never know enough about where our money's going to have grounds to do it, and so that's what I'm concerned about. Is
If I could maybe just propose, we'll give that some thought. And
Okay.
we'll work with the attorney's office and come up with either language here or figure out if it's covered somewhere else, maybe in the actual contract with that vendor that says they're supposed to provide us information as follows, and they don't, then they're in breach of contract. But we'll come back to you when we come to the council with our thoughts on that, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Right.
Please proceed, Bill.
The next item that's important is the debarment proceedings. And this is where it may partially answer your question. The proceedings will be more on an informal basis. It's not going to be like a court. And again, I'll probably re-hit these points later on. The level of evidence requirements are not going to be the same as court either, which kind of relates into number 8, which is the debarment hearing officer's authority. The person's going to make their decision based on the preponderance of the evidence. It's not going to be the same level of.
Bill, before we proceed onward to 8, Councilmember Francisco has a question on 7.
Thank you. I just want to clarify this and make sure I understand it. The very last item under the grounds for debarment, at the top of page 8, one of the grounds being the person submitted 2 or more claims of computational or other error in a bid to the city within a 2-year period. What exactly does that mean?
A lot of times with bids, we'll have multiple items, and it's not uncommon. They might be the apparent low bidder, and then they come back and go, "Oh, I made a math error," and they want to change their bid. So if they have a history of always trying to change their bid after the opening,
Okay.
that could be potential grounds.
Thank you.
So we're still on 8. Sorry to interrupt, Bill.
The last few are kind of all related. On 8 is, again, the hearing officer is going to make his or her decision based on the preponderance of evidence. And again, it's not going to be the same level as if you went to court. And that's highlighted in paragraph 9, standard of proof. The standard of proof for the debarment hearing shall be the preponderance of the evidence. So long as you can show that their appears to be a problem, the evidence supports that, you don't have to prove that they intentionally destroyed the records you're asking. If you can show that you asked 3 or 4 times and they can't produce them, that's sufficient. And then the last item is liability for increased cost. If we have to debar somebody and bring in another vendor or contractor and there's increased cost, we can go back to them and they can need to make us whole by paying the difference in cost.
Mr. House?
If we can look back at number 8 for just a minute here. First of all, I see that there's that the decision may be appealed to the City Council. It also says that the appeal does not stay the debarment hearing officer's decision, so then the debarment would be in force until council heard the appeal. And the only thing that I see missing, and it may not belong here, but it would seem like it would need to be in a contract somewhere if this is going to become part of some standard contract language, is some agreement that then if let's say it were defined in favor of the individual or the company, that we're not liable somehow for the losses during that period of time during which the debarment officer has made a decision and the appeal came in favor, say, of the contractor. And I think we need to be careful about that, because here we've made it's a little opposite. In some cases, once something's on appeal, everything sort of goes on hold or things stay status quo. This one is actually making sure that the debarment officer's decision is in force until the appeal is heard. And maybe, Mr. Vincent, you could take a look at that and just see if we're at any risk at that point.
Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to take a look at that prior to this returning to the City Council. One thought I have right now is if the council upholds the contractor's appeal, then the contractor goes back to having the benefit of their bargain. They step back into the contract and they continue with that particular contract that's given rise to it. This debarment process could also occur outside of a contractual scenario where we have a situation, the computational error question previously as an example. We could have a contractor who has satisfied that debarment ground by submitting bids with it's not a word I usually use. Computational errors. They may not even be the lowest bidder and therefore awarded the contract. But because they've satisfied that ground, and because the city doesn't want, as Mr. Hornig mentioned before, the purpose of debarment is so that the city is not burdened with having irresponsible, non-responsive contractors participating in the process. It's for a fairness matter for the other contractors who are following the rules, but also it benefits the city in that if we have an irresponsible or non-responsive contractor becoming the low bidder, we're stuck with a scenario of either rejecting that bid and rejecting all the other bids and going through the process again in order to hopefully get a different low bidder. It adds process to this and cost to the contracting process that is a burden to the city. And so it may not always be in a circumstance where it's a contractual performance occurring, but we will look at that question.
I wish you would. I mean, this process may take place once a contract has been let, right, and then it's actually in process, and perhaps something comes up that, on our side, if you will, we see that there's been a violation that meets one of these qualifiers here, and we're intervening. That stop work or whatever it is that goes on for 2 months or however long it takes to get an appeal and go through that process. This is a little different from where everything would be status quo until the appeal was resolved. There would be actually a stop of work, and there could be some losses associated with it, and even maybe someone could countersue and think that somehow our debarment process was harming their reputation or something. So I think we need to be thinking about that, and you probably already have, but I just thought I'd bring it up.
No, those are good points. The debarment process, it does anticipate the potential for a debarment to occur while a contract is actually being performed, and there's I believe it's on page 11 of your attachment, it's paragraph 17, the effect of a debarment or suspension on existing contracts. So this debarment process does anticipate that potential scenario where the actions of a contractor in the performance of a contract, or while that contractor has multiple contracts pending with the city, it anticipates those situations and deals with it. I'll go back and look to address the particular questions you've had regarding whether in the context if the council upholds an appeal of a contractor, how does that play out?
Great. The specific language is on page on page 8 of 12 under 8C, and what gave rise to my question was the last sentence in paragraph C that says the filing of a request for appeal of the debarment decision shall not stay the debarment hearing officer's decision. That's what gave rise to my concern.
Please proceed, Mr. Hornick.
I think basically we're done. I was just going to point out, Section 16 liability. Again, if we have to replace the contractor with a higher price contractor, they need to make us whole and pay the difference. It's kind of the flip side of the coin that Councilman House brought up. So,
Mr. Chair, before we move on, I have a couple other points about the debarment process I think that will be important for your consideration. One is a key provision is that we're dealing with affiliates. These are contractual companies. In most cases, are artificial entities, LLCs, corporations, which can, in order to circumvent a debarment, just recreate themselves. And one key thing to understand about this debarment process is it has a very broad term of person, and it has a very broad definition of the word affiliate. And it imbues a new entity that has persons in control of that new entity who have been previously debarred. It affects the new entity as well, so that a person can't simply circumvent or thwart a debarment process by reinventing themselves with a new fictional entity. And so that you can understand that process.
that came
Thank you,
about
Mr.
from
Munsett. That's a very good point, and something that obviously we want to be able to cover, but something that we might overlook without your participation. Mr. Horning, you had one last point before questions. Any other questions from the committee members? Mr. House.
Sorry to be so curious, but I just happen to be. Is there any way to get off the list once you're on it?
Yes.
It's not a permanent debarment, except for some rare instances. So you may debar someone for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. So once that term is up, they can come back and they're free to bid on business again.
Mr. Chair.
The answer is yes.
Yes, the debarment process provides for two different actions. One is a suspension and one is a debarment. The suspension is a lesser action. A debarment is a more firm action by the council. And even within the debarment, the council may set a time or have it be a permanent debarment. There are a limited number of circumstances that are grounds for a permanent debarment, while as the number of circumstances that justify a temporary debarment, a period of time, is a more broad set of circumstances.
And there's even a third route, which is, in some cases, an agreement not to bid in lieu of a debarment.
Correct.
And any other questions from the committee? I will open up public comment if the one member of the public that's here is here for this item, but I'm not sure that that's the case. So I will. Are you here, sir, to comment on this item or on another for the council?
I was here for a city vote.
Okay. All right. That's at 2 o'clock. So seeing no other members of the public here, I'll close the public hearing, and it's to the committee. Any comments or questions from the committee? Is there a motion?
Mr. Chair, I'll move that we, let's see, I was going to be sure we did this correctly here. We we send this to City Council for their consideration with changes and revisions as in response to the questions that the staff heard today.
Second.
And I'll just, before we vote, just say thank you, Mr. Hornig. Your time here has been very, very valuable to creating a purchasing policy that reflects our values, but also is transparent enough and discourages practices that could cause us to spend more money just by sort of laziness. And so I really appreciate the work that you have done. We always seem to give you really easy, exciting jobs that don't require any detail work whatsoever. I know I'm being facetious. They're tedious. I know that require a lot of detail and sometimes quite complicated. But we really appreciate your work.
And Mr. Chair,
I have good staff that help me out, so they appreciate those challenges.
well, you do a great job. And I just want to comment. First of all, this is for the ordinance and the resolution, just to be clear, the one motion for both. And what I really find helpful as a representative of the people of Santa Barbara is that I can understand this when I read it. It's in lay people's language, with the exception of one definition, which I really appreciate your putting in there for us. But I think it's important that a typical business person who might want to do business with the city, that this is approachable to them, that they can actually get their hands around it, get their mind around it, and participate the way that we really want them to. And I think that's what you're trying to do, is make it really user friendly, and it is about responsibility. So I really appreciate the way you guys have put this together.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for saving us money. And with that, we'll say all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? Motion carries, and we'll adjourn.
Thank you.